Good morning. It's great to be back at Ecosperity Week. I'm Arunabha Ghosh. I run the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. It's an independent policy research institution headquartered in New Delhi. We work across India and in several other parts of the world. Our job is to try and get data, integrated analysis, and our outreach to impact sustainable development at scale. Today, I want to talk to you about resilience. But when we think about resilience, we start thinking about adaptation. But I would argue to you that resilience is about how we bounce back better, whether we are doing a mitigation, whether we're doing adaptation, or the intersections between the two. So I'm going to talk to you about first, resilience for lives and livelihoods. Second, resilience for the power grid. Third, resilience for supply chains. And finally, resilience across the food, energy, water systems. All systems go, right? We are living in a time which has become extremely stressed. We're living in a region which has become extremely stressed. Across the world, we're seeing hundreds of extreme weather events and trillions of dollars of damages that have occurred over the last 2 decades. But here in Asia, it's our economic prosperity which is also making us more vulnerable to the economic losses that result from the extreme weather events. This map, which my organization has developed, is part of the first high resolution climate resilience atlas that we're developing for India. You can see from the map that of our 700 odd districts, we now are living in a country where 3/4 of the districts have become hotspots for extreme climate events. 80% of Indians are living in areas that are extremely vulnerable to a multiplicity of floods, droughts, cyclones, or the compounding effects of each. And more troubling is that about 40% of our districts are showing a swapping trend. What was originally flood prone is becoming drought prone region. What was originally drought prone is becoming flood prone. So, how do we build resilience for lives and livelihoods? I'm going to give you an example from a single city. We've got 4,000 plus cities in India. This is a tiny city just north of Mumbai called Thane. Resilience is hyper local. We've developed a ward by ward heat action plan which combines heat and humidity combined with the kind of economic activity, the kind of social indicators, the income levels, so that you understand vulnerability in that very neighborhood oriented way. Once we start doing that, you can then deploy the public capital and the community engagement in a way that is much more equitable and inclusive. Similarly, we are developing neighborhood by neighborhood flood mitigation plans. While India has done a remarkable job of doing early warning systems across its long coastline, within inland cities, less than 30% of the population is currently covered from early warning for urban floods. Getting that right at a neighborhood level is critical. And the same applies for getting air pollution monitoring right, again at a neighborhood by neighborhood level. At the end of the day, if it's lives and livelihoods that we want to make resilient, it has to become hyper local. But on one side, while that is happening, we're also building out a very large electricity system built on clean energy. Over the last decade and a half, India has become the fourth largest renewables player in the world in terms of deployed capacity. But as the headlines from across the world show us that we need resilience for the grid as well. The recent events in Spain and Portugal are not alone in their occurrence. Here in this part of the world, in India, there is this worry that will clean energy be reliable and resilient as we meet the high energy demand? In India alone, the energy demand will keep rising. Right now, you see about 1,400 odd billion units of energy electricity consumption, rising nearly 4 times by 2045. What's more important is that in a hot country like ours, and again, hot, humid places like rest of Asia, the peak power demand, the states above the red line, is growing faster than the electricity demand on average. So, how do you build an energy system that meets for the peak power without having idling capacity, but which is also resilient? And some of the interesting modeling that my team has been doing, which is modeling the entire Indian power system, the fourth largest power system in the world, down to a 15-minute dispatch level, we see, guess what? That your greatest resilience comes from injecting even more clean energy into the system. Right now, our targets are for 500 gigawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity by 2030. India's already reached 228 gigawatts. But what our analysis is showing is that getting to 600 gigawatts, whether you have moderate or high energy demand, actually gives you the most resilient grid at the lowest cost. And I can get into the reasons why during the Q&A. So how do we go from 228 gigawatts to 600 or 500 gigawatts of clean energy electricity capacity? Of course, we've got to invest in storage and battery energy systems. But we've also got to leverage the distributed nature of the clean energy opportunity. In India, there are different programs, 10 million homes in the urban areas getting rooftop solar, or the world's largest solar irrigation system in rural areas. We've also got to bring in demand flexibility on how we optimize for the electrons, whether the sun is shining or whether the wind is blowing. And increasingly also now thinking about other forms of clean energy capacity. For instance, the recent big push for 100 gigawatts of nuclear capacity over the next 2 decades. That brings us then to the third dimension of resilience. If we start building out a very large power grid reliant on clean energy, is that secure, not just resilient? And here's the challenge for many parts of the emerging markets. There are concentrated supply chains, whether it's lithium-ion batteries or solar PV. What that graphic shows you is over the last decade, the number of countries that have concentrated supplies of these clean energy products have increased, say, for 38 to 71 for solar, or from 19 to 49 for batteries. Similarly, there is deep concentration with critical minerals. 15 countries accounting for about 55% of identified critical minerals for the transition, over 70 to 90% of the actual production. And then there is concentration in the clean tech patterns. Only 5 G20 countries account for over 90% or nearly 90% of all clean energy or clean tech patents being filed. Now, while this is good for the planet as a whole, we still need to see how do Asian economies and emerging markets across the world start thinking about distributing the clean energy supply chains, whether it's products, minerals, or tech. And one of the interesting analyses we've done is actually to think about component by component comparative advantage. We've done that for India, but in so, we are also looking at which geographies have comparative advantage for which components. Is it a wafer? Is it the polysilicon? Is it the aluminum foil? Is the junction box? Is it the silver paste? This way, we can build resilient supply chains across our economies while also building the clean tech industries at home. The same applies for electrolyzers for green hydrogen. And in order to do that, we therefore need to build a resilient global architecture for critical minerals on one hand, for instance, a consortium for joint exploration, for tracking and assessment, a minerals exchange platform, blockchain-based traceability, and equally thinking about comprehensively tracking clean energy supply chains, looking at new avenues of supply, standards and certification, co-developing these technologies. And that therefore brings me to the final part of the resilience story. From people to power systems to supply chains to the ecosystems. This is not just an energy transition, this is an economic transformation we're talking about. And you can't have an economic transformation unless we think about various other constraints. When we build a clean energy system, we think about solar and wind power load, plant load factors. But then we also have to think about land prices, social conflicts over land, population density, the water availability or not, impact of climate risks on our clean energy infrastructure, even earthquake risks. Even after putting in all these constraints, guess what? In India, at least, we find that we have a potential of 7,000 gigawatts of clean energy capacity, over 46 million tons of green hydrogen capacity that's possible. So, how do we do that? And that's my last slide. We've got to understand that the energy nexus, when you bring in food, water, climate, land, is complex because we're already thinking about those interactions. But it's also getting much more complicated with the rise of AI and the demand for energy, but also the way you can optimize for the electrons using AI. The geopolitics and the concentrated supply chains, the trade barriers that complicate how we optimize for our resources across our geographies. And that then gets compounded by the climate shocks coming our way. This is not going to be an easy transition. But once we start thinking about resilience, we understand that at the end of the day, it's people right at the heart of our systems change. You leverage people properly, you save lives, save livelihoods, build out a resilient power grid, build out interdependent resilient supply chains, and make sure that the ecosystems of energy, water, land, food interact in a positive way for a net positive world. Thank you.